Michel Foucault's perspective, quest for a new mode of being. We will never find the truth of our being, postmodern philosopher of history Michel Foucault said, if we assume identities articulated in influential power discourses. Our identities, he explained, are forged in the dominant power discourses of our culture, and as long as we buy into them, we limit our possibility for change. Our self-perceptions, Foucault said, are external constructions. Even our desires are constructed, he believed. Foucault maintained our experience of ourselves was shaped in the medical, political, sexual, and other discourses prevalent in our day that create who we are and limit what we can be. It is impossible to totally dominate the self, he felt. Understanding, he believed, could be the means to our psychic survival. Knowledge was the tool we could use to fight against people and institutions who tried to define for us what was true about ourselves, said Foucault. What was needed, he said, was a critical knowledge, the gathering and dissemination of information that didn't pretend to be truth. He saw truth and reason as effects of power. When one makes truth claims, he believed, it is an assertion of power. Foucault did not believe in absolute truth. Knowledge, he said, might just be self-delusion. The truth claims we are exposed to, he said, are always the product of the culture we live in. Each society had its regime of truth, he said, determined which discourses were permitted. Truth for Foucault is what dominant groups in society say it is. It always operates within a particular discourse. When we claim to get at truth, Foucault said, we merely substitute one system of power, one discourse for another. Different discourses, Foucault said, circumscribe what can be said or thought or written about in different historical periods. They limit how we see the world. Foucault defines a discourse as a body of knowledge. In our age, he said, the scientific discourse is the one making truth claims. Foucault saw being as the effect of discourses. Discourses affect what we perceive, how we judge, what we can imagine, what we do. Discourses, he explained further, are knowledges that make up various disciplines such as psychiatry, medicine, economics, and linguistics. Each discipline has its own discourses, he said, objects which are studied, techniques with which it treats the objects, theories and concepts which make up its language. Discourses didn't merely represent what is real, Foucault said. They construct it. What Foucault tried to do was to get outside the different discourses. What was needed, he thought, was a critical knowledge, a critical consciousness that didn't pretend to be truth. The example he gives in the way he lived his life was of a self that was thinking, that constantly challenged the forces that limit possibility. A new mechanism of power, he said, had emerged in modern society that exerted control over every life process from birth to sexuality to death. He refers to this new mechanism of power as disciplinary power. At the core of this disciplinary power, he said, is a disparity between agents. One person is assumed to have superior knowledge, which is the basis for the exercise of power. Power, he said, can only be exercised when it is integrated with knowledge. Knowledge, he believed, depends on power. In modern society, man becomes an object of domination and observation, he said, by a network of experts of power knowledge who define what normality is for us. He saw the same disciplinary techniques of power used in a variety of institutions, from schools to hospitals, from psychiatric institutions to different agencies of bureaucracy. Discipline was affected through spatial arrangements in a classroom. It might be the arrangement of desks. There was control of activity, for instance, conformance to a timetable. There was support of a hierarchy, steps that needed to be taken in a learning process. There were tactics used for coordination. One of the aims of these various institutions, such as schools or the military or prisons, was to create docile bodies. They seek to make us more malleable through discipline and observation, emphasizing obedience in an effort to control what bodies say and do and think, maintained Foucault. In modern society, surveillance was used to get conformance to correct behavior by getting the other to internalize the right way to behave. Foucault's message was that we can overcome the conditioning of power discourses we've been exposed to. We could war against all those forces that stood as a barrier to our self-creation. We could liberate our desire by fighting. Or we could imitate the conduct of the average man and become the slaves of the normative code of our time. His way was to dedicate himself to his own self-formation and determine for himself the mode of being he wanted his life to be about. The key was experience, Foucault believed. Our experience can help us to escape the bonds of the discourses of institutions that tie us up in knots, that double their efforts to keep us restrained if they sense our attempt to escape. Wherever we find power, Foucault said, there also we find resistance. Knowledge and understanding, he believed, were the means through which we could care for ourselves. We had to get free of categorization, he believed. Foucault described classifications as mere representations of the mind. It's not a matter of discovering who we are underneath our social condition, but of inventing who we would be, Foucault believed. He defines the practice of liberty as transgressing the limits that are imposed on us by knowledge power. He saw the self as a task that needed our attention. The ethical life was lived, said Foucault, when we became our own project. Our potential was to be found by assessing the limits imposed on us and transgressing them. I'm going to repeat that. Our potential was to be found by assessing the limits imposed on us and transgressing them, Foucault maintained. While we can never escape our historical situation, Foucault believed, we could strive to increase our freedom within it. Fulfillment for Foucault would be found with the actualization of our possibilities. Foucault's method was to read everything, to study everything, to try to get beyond the disciplinary ordering of information of his day. His method was that of historical inquiry. The focus of his analyses were texts and institutions. He tried to study how specific forms of power were constructed and functioned. He wanted to analyze the mechanisms of power, how it unfolds, its effects, its connections, and extensions. He used the term archaeology to describe his method of analyzing the formation of discourses to uncover how disciplinary knowledge changed through history and what conditions allowed them to arise. If we wanted to understand what we say and do, he felt, we had to understand the rules we chose to guide our lives by. Thus he sought to look at the underlying forms that determined what we saw as true and false. For Foucault, power was a domain that had to be studied to be survived. We had to recognize oppression before we could resist it, he said. For resistance to work, he said, it had to be aimed at the technique of power being used. It is when the technique of power is refused that change happens, he said. The hypothesis that Foucault puts forth is that it's all against all. We all fight each other, and there is always within each of us something that fights something else. Power doesn't come from a particular point, for instance, the state. Rather, Foucault said, in reality, power means relations, a more or less organized, hierarchical, coordinated cluster of relations. Foucault saw relations of power at every point in the social body, between a man and a woman, between members of a family, between master and his pupil, between everyone who knows and everyone who does not. Power for him wasn't about law and prohibition. It was coextensive with the social body. Relations of mental force were everywhere being exercised, Foucault thought. The exercise of power came through concepts and ideas and techniques that were exercised. He saw power as a struggle, where on one side you had an agent seeking to control or dominate, and the social network which supported him against the desires of another agent. Power, he said, was exercised by an agent only to the extent he could maintain an alliance with other agents whose actions supported him. Power, for Foucault, wasn't something an agent had. It couldn't exist, he explained, without a network of agents that support it and others that resist it. Power was always enmeshed in a web of social alignments. Foucault believed that our experience of ourselves is shaped by a multiplicity of force relations expressed in the power-knowledge discourses that make up our social environment. Though liberty is at the core of the human essence, he maintained, our first experiences are experiences of limit. Foucault believed there were no universal prescriptions. What worked for you might be a disaster for me. In order to get out of the box of thinking and acting as we should, we have to find the words for that which has no words in us. We had to replace our belief in the classifications and orderings of authorities with a trust in our own experience. We needed to fight being pigeonholed into categories of identity. The self exists, Foucault tells us, because it is impossible for it to be totally dominated. It is the small acts of resistance, Foucault felt, that were important. The fight we must fight is the fight against congealed identity. His message to us is that we are freer than we think. We can question what others tell us is truth. We can transform ourselves, not by seeking to find out who we are, but by understanding that we never remain the same. For Foucault, being is becoming.